And in the interest of time, we'll move on to the last presenter tonight, or early this morning, depending on where you are. Chelsea Fisher. Since completing her PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan 2 years ago, she has worked as an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at Washington and Lee University, located on the traditional lands of the Monocan. Chelsea uses archaeological approaches to investigate the long-term histories of ancient Maya traditional ecological knowledge and their connection to current environmental justice conflicts faced by indigenous Maya communities. She has published articles on in-field agriculture in Maya cities, the political dynamics of milpa farming, celebrity chefs in Yucatán, and the role of archaeology for supporting sustainable agricultural systems. Chelsea's talk is titled Food Justice, Celebrity Chefs, and the Archaeology of Farming Communities in the Yaxunah Ejido, Yucatán. Please welcome Chelsea Fisher.
Thank you. While I'm setting this up, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to everybody who's powering through into this 5th hour on Zoom. I salute you. Imagine that it's 2017. So it's 2017, and this fellow, Rene Redzepi, Danish celebrity chef, who works at the so-called greatest restaurant in the world, Noma, in Copenhagen. He's at Chichen Itza. He's been going around the Yucatán Peninsula with his staff, scouting ingredients for an upcoming pop-up of his restaurant that's going to be opening soon in Tulum. On this trip out to Chichen Itza, he and his team stop at the Maya community of Yaxunah, which you've already heard about tonight in Harper and Tracy's talk. So when they're out at Yaxunah, the team eats tortillas, they eat cochinita tacos, and later they say that it was the best tortilla that they've ever tried in their entire life. So right there on the spot, Redzepi and his team, they make a deal with the people in Yaxunah to source from them not just the maize for the tortillas, but also some vegetables. And they also hire women to come and cook on the floor of Noma, Mexico for its 6-week run. These women who go into Tulum to cook show up in high-profile social media posts. One of them gains enough attention, as you heard about earlier, to get her own Netflix special. And when sales open up for the pop-up, it sells out almost instantly. The folks who go to eat there are paying $750 US after tax each for the privilege of eating at Noma, Mexico. Now it's still 2017, but we're somewhere else on the peninsula. We're near Playa del Carmen. And here in 2017, the Vulcan Materials Company has entered its 3rd decade of mining limestone from an area of over 1,200 hectares, a former farmland that's rapidly expanding. Most of the limestone that's mined here will be exported to the United States, where some of it will be used to build a border wall. Further west in the peninsula, it's 2017, and by now it's been about a year since a renewable energy company lied to the community of Muna and told them that they were interested in buying some of their community lands for a citrus orchard. When it emerged that they actually wanted to construct a solar park on 300 hectares of community-owned lands, the mega project then adopted a different strategy, where it began forging community members' signatures on legal documents to push the project forward without their consent. Tensions mount, and in a year from now, there will be several attacks with machetes within the community, further dividing community members with regards to the project. And it's 2017 in the center of the peninsula, where Grupo Quequén, the biggest producer of pork in Mexico, has just gotten approval on its environmental impact statement, which gives them the go-ahead to build an industrial feedlot for more than 49,000 pigs. They're planning to build this feedlot right near the community of Homun, which unfortunately Most of the people there make their living by leading ecotourism around the cenotes. And so you can imagine how 49,000 pigs in a feedlot next door are going to pose some problems. The local community was not consulted at all in this process. And thanks to the resistance efforts that they put up in response, within 2 years, the project will be temporarily suspended. Now, I bring up these stories from 2017, and they might sound at first like they're telling different stories. But the idea I want to explore tonight with you all is how these ideas, these stories are actually part of the one unfolding thread of land grabbing and illegal land dispossession that's happening currently in Mexico and many other places within the tropics. I want to consider the question with you all tonight of how we as archaeologists might use the collaboration that we have with communities to push back against what I call the unused land narrative that's undermining Indigenous Maya food sovereignty. Because the thing is with these stories that I'm opening with, they all depend or in some way sustain a narrative that the farmlands around communities in Yucatán are no longer being used like they used to be, and therefore communities' best interests are served by selling the land. So my question tonight is how we as archaeologists might use our work to push back against this unused land narrative in efforts to support current Indigenous Maya food sovereignty. So as I mentioned, I work in the community of Yaxunah. This is where Redzepi and his team tried those tortillas that changed their lives and that so many people paid $750 to eat. Yaxunah is a community located in the northern Maya lowlands. And like other communities in Mexico, the town is surrounded by a collective agricultural landholding called an Ejido. So Yaxunah's Ejido is 4,066 hectares, and people use it for farming, but that's happening less and less as time goes on. They also use it for collecting firewood, for grazing animals, for raising honeybees, and there's also a bunch of archaeological sites in the Ejido. For a long time, after the Mexican government granted communities their Ejido lands almost 100 years ago now, it was designed in such a way that communities couldn't sell their lands. They were held in perpetuity and rights to those lands were passed down over generations. But with NAFTA, with the neoliberalization of Mexico's agrarian sector and revisions to the Mexican Constitution, it became legal to privatize Ejido lands. So communities can now decide to sell some or all of their former landholding. While there, in theory, are ways that communities can leverage this new law to their advantage and to their benefit, unfortunately, this opens the door to land grabbing. So private corporations have come in and looked for ways to either illegally just outright grab land from communities, or in some cases, they use legal channels, but in ways that are sometimes manipulative or deceitful. And even in cases where they are completely legal, a lot of times also there's pressure involved in those decisions. And the important thing that I want to focus on here is that these land grabs are very much entrenched within this narrative of unused lands. And where does this unused land narrative come from? How is this being created? I trace a lot of this to climate change. So in recent years, as the climate has become increasingly unpredictable in Yucatán, as in many places, the signals that farmers used to be able to rely on to know when it was time to burn their fields, when it was time to plant, they're no longer as predictable as they used to be. Farming has become a riskier prospect as a result. And what this means is that fewer and fewer people are relying on farming for their subsistence because it's so risky now because of climate change that for many of them, it's not worth the effort. In Yaxunah, what is a much more reliable way of living is to look for opportunities to earn cash. So in Yaxunah, being that we're so close to Chichen Itza, a lot of folks carve wooden masks to sell as souvenirs to tourists in Chichen Itza. For a lot of people in communities like Yaxunah and elsewhere in the peninsula, it means leaving their towns to go and seek work either in construction or in the touristic sector in places like Cancun and in Merida. And with the cash that folks are earning through these jobs, they're able to buy most of their food, right? So NAFTA has already come up a couple times tonight. And of course, with these changes that happened in the 90s as Mexico was flooded with cheap corn from the United States, it completely changed the landscape of food that's available to eat. So I really like the way that the anthropologist Alicia Galvez has framed this in thinking about how NAFTA has replaced food sovereignty, which is where communities have a say in the foods that they're eating. They have a say in how those foods are being produced. It replaced food sovereignty with food security, which is really just a simple equation of, is there enough calories for everybody? You can't argue in this post-NAFTA landscape that we're in that there aren't enough calories theoretically available for everybody, right? But as Galvez points out, this means that for a lot of rural Mexicans, their sustenance is coming not from traditional foods like tortillas, but rather, you might say, their corny cousin of high fructose corn syrup, beverages like Coca-Cola, white bread, and white noodles. And as you've already heard tonight too, and the talk that Harper gave on behalf of her and Tracy, Yaxunah has a particularly interesting case because of its attention that it's gotten from celebrity chefs and how this has changed its landscape of food. Now, so much of the food landscape within Yaxunah comes down to questions of the expectations of authenticity and sustainability for outsiders who are coming in seeking to pay money for a tourist experience. So an example of this is that on some social media posts put forward by tourists, you'll see them promoting this idea of the so-called sustainable milpa, which is a milpa that doesn't involve burning, which is contrary to the way that milpa is traditionally practiced. The way that this casts milpa, though, is that because trees are burned in the process, it must be unsustainable. And so in promoting an intensive milpa that doesn't move around on the landscape, they're promoting this as somehow better, somehow more sustainable, when in reality, that is making the forested lands where traditional burning and traditional milpa agriculture is practiced, it's promoting this idea that they're unused, that those lands are no longer necessary. So all of these factors combine and coalesce to create this sense that these lands, Ejido lands that now can be sold, are not useful, they're not used. And this increases vulnerability for privatization and land grabbing. And what I'm going to be arguing today is that this decision to sell, which is likely irreversible in most of the cases, because these were lands that were granted. And so to be able to buy them back is unlikely for so many communities. This loss of land undermines long-term food sovereignty and resilience for these communities. Now, to echo something that Shanti had just been saying about not, feeling in a place to make decisions for people, I want to emphasize here that as an outsider, it is certainly not my place, and I don't want to criticize any community that decides to sell their lands. I can't imagine the decisions that go into deciding to do something like that after having been owners of land for such a long time. What I do want to criticize, what I do want to push back against, though, are the structures and systems that have given these communities such an impossible choice to begin with. This is not a choice that communities should have to make. And so I want to explore how archaeology could be used to push back against those systems that have thrust this decision upon so many communities in the Maya area to sell or not to sell their land. So I'm going to talk about two ways that I've been exploring this through archaeology in the Yaxunah Ejido. The two ways I'll talk about it first will be looking at the research I've been doing in Yaxunah, documenting long-term histories of traditional ecological knowledge, which you'll hear me sometimes call TEK, in landscapes of the Ejido, of the landholding, and then also through the act of eating together in the field. So we'll start first with documenting long-term histories of traditional ecological knowledge in landscapes. Here's another image of a map of the eastern portion of the Yaxunah Ejido, where I've done most of my work. So you'll see on the far left of your screen, there's the town of Yaxunah. Move a little bit to the right or east, and you'll see the most famous site in the Ejido, Yaxunah, which is famous for being at one end of the longest road that the Maya, pre-contact Maya ever built, connecting Yaxunah and the city of Koba, about 100 kilometers away. And you go even further to the right, and you'll see Zacohuil, which is a site where I've done most of my research within the Ejido. And Zacohuil is an interesting place to consider these questions. One, because of its occupation history, a lot of formative or pre-classic stuff is really well preserved. The other is that it's way out on the edge of the Yaxunah Ejido. So I realized over time, even though it was kind of a pain to be so far from town, you know, we all complained about it a lot in the long truck drives out there, but there were advantages to being at this edge of the Ejido because we were precisely in these lands that were being contested as useful or not. So keeping that in mind, just to introduce a little bit about TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, and the types of agriculture that it is used to support within the Yaxunah Ejido. For a lot of folks who are already familiar with Maya agriculture, this will be familiar to you, but we can think of in Yucatán, agriculture is these two systems, these two practices that are closely linked. So on the one side, you have house lot agriculture. Sometimes you'll hear this called home gardening. It's long-term cultivation that happens in intra-settlement lands. So that means the land that's directly surrounding your home. So it's spaces between and around homes, and it's intensive. By intensive, I mean there's a lot of inputs that are going in. So you're weeding, you're watering, you're keeping pests away. There's a lot of inputs going on, and this allows the land to be cultivated over and over again, right? On the other side, we have Milpa Agriculture, which is slash and burn farming. You'll hear it called. It's shifting, and it requires access to a lot of forested land. So Milpa, if you're not familiar with it, it involves selecting a parcel of forested land, clearing the vegetation, letting it dry, burning it, then planting in it. You can do that 2 seasons in a row, and then after that, the ground needs to rest or fallow for 7, 10, even more years. And today, in modern, contemporary Yucatán, the emphasis has been on the milpa. So most of the staples, most of the food in contemporary agriculture, putting aside NAFTA for a second, has come through this shifting agricultural practice. Household agriculture, gardening is still important, but it's mostly seen more in a supplemental role today. But I wanted to use the archaeology I was doing in the Yaxunah Ejido to investigate, okay, well, was it always like this? And is it really just about switching between one or the other, or can we begin to recognize kind of a gradient between these practices that would have gone together? So I assembled a team to do a TEK-based survey of Zacohuil and the lands in the eastern portion of the Ejido. And so we had 4 Yaxunah men who were experienced Milpa farmers and 2 Yaxunah women who were experienced home gardeners. And we together walked the landscape of Zacohuil, having conversations and just making observations in place about different plant communities in the landscape. We looked a lot at differences in soil in different parts of the site and had conversations about agricultural potential and tried to figure out why people were choosing to live where they were. We also spent a lot of time documenting areas of exposed bedrock, which are plentiful in Yucatán, to understand how that articulated with the settlement. And what this gave us then was a map that I added on to LiDAR imaging and traditional Mahler style maps of the site to show this mosaic-like distribution of concavales, which are these soil-rich areas, and sequales, which are exposed bedrock. And as you can see in the map of Zacohuil, there's this monumental core that really dominates the site. So we have the Zacohuil Acropolis, which is a pyramid, Zacohuil Sacbe, which is a road. I'm not going to be talking about those so much today, but these other little structures around it, those are houses. And I'm going to be focusing on the formative settlement and what this TEK-based survey tells us about how traditional agriculture was changing from the formative till now. What I was really excited to find in the excavations and survey that my team and I did at Sakawil was that in the formative, during the era when people first settled down to begin farming in the Yaxunah Ejido about 2,000 years ago, the emphasis was on intra-settlement lands. The emphasis was on intensive practices that were located between and around houses. And so to share with you a little bit of how my team and I came to that interpretation, if we look just at the formative settlement, so in this image, I've taken out a later terminal classic settlement that came to the site. These structures are houses that were settled during the late and terminal formative. And what I want you to notice here is that these houses, unlike ones that would come later, chose to settle on these isolated bedrock outcrops that I like to think of as kind of floating within a sea of concave, within a sea of soil. And you'll notice that they preserve spaces between and around their houses. This pattern is consistent with other places where we think the Maya were practicing a kind of low density urban agriculture. Keeping these spaces open around the house would have allowed for intensive practices right there. When my team and I, we investigated these intersettlement areas by excavating trenches in them, and we also did soil chemistry analysis in these trenches. And what we found was that the oldest houses at the site also had picked places where the soil was the deepest and had the fewest amounts of exposed bedrock in it. So this to me suggests that there was this emphasis on planting the home within these soil-rich concavales during this early period so that people would be able to cultivate around their homes. Now, something interesting is that when we did the TEK-based survey and throughout seasons of working at Sakawil, people would often complain about the soil there. They would say, nobody wants to plant milpa in this concave. This is, my grandfather planted here once, but nobody's planted here since, and it's not good soil. And it's interesting because it was always said in a way of, this isn't good soil for milpa. I did find, though, in an account of Maya ethnopedology, so that's indigenous Maya soil science, that this particular type of soil, concave, has been cited as being the preferred soil for intensive practices. So even though by today's standards, this isn't the best soil, during a time when intensive agriculture was favored, this might have been a reason to settle down here and begin farming. And for us archaeologists, a lot of our interpretations about what was happening in the land we can get from houses, right? And so in excavations that my team and I did of these houses, we were able to also interpret signs of commitments to place that are consistent with this investment in intra-settlement agriculture. So consider, for example, that late formative and terminal formative houses at Sakawil are very large and they use a lot of stone. It's not a coincidence, I think, that this is also the time period that Sakawil and many other sites have their biggest monumental buildings going up. I think that this stone would have been gathered, accumulated organically during processes of stone clearing that would have happened as part of preparations for intensification. As all of this stone was built up and used to be reorganized into these new forms of dwellings and expressing relationships to the land, we also see instances where these homes would be expanded over time. So what you're seeing here with the Chamal group are images of a renovation that we found where a second structure had been added. And as folks in Maya archaeology are familiar, these are also often interpreted as signs of the family growing, of multi-generational living together, which suggests, again, this type of permanent commitment to place that's consistent with intensive agriculture around the home. And sometimes this would be ritually commemorated through the caching of offerings. So in the Hotch group, which happens to be the oldest house group at Sakawil, we found in the construction of a late formative house, so that means this was a house built by early farmers at the site, we found that they had placed an offering of a middle formative bowl within the construction of their house. So again, these are farming people. This bowl is probably from a time before people settled down to farm. So it may have been some sort of heirloom. that was cached into the house. And these types of heirloom offerings are often, again, interpreted in this way of solidifying and materializing multi-generational connections between people and place. And I think that that also then emphasizes this point that there was something different going on than the shifting agriculture that we would see emerge later. So at Zacahuil, by the time the classic reoccupation comes, there's signs that this switch over to emphasizing Milpa had already taken place. And that emphasis appears to have continued until contemporary times. What I think is really exciting about the future of this kind of work, though, is that it's clearly not a light switch, right? It's clearly not ever a case of you're doing one or the other. And so what I'm really excited to keep exploring in the Yaxunah Ejido are ways that we might be able to recognize how this TEK was adjusted, how communities or even individual households made decisions over time about what types of agricultural practices to pursue. So the lessons that I take from this is that TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, it's not static, right? It's historically contingent. It's informed by the present moment, by the social changes, the political changes, and it's dynamic. It can change over time. We can't just assume that people were doing the things we see traditional agriculturalists doing today in the past. I think it's really exciting that this long-term resilience appears to be tied to flexibility. So the ability to make the decision to invest more in one of these strategies than another, and there's others too, right? To go hunting, to do things like that, to trade for food. There's flexibility that is so evident within what was happening. And it seems like that was key to the long-term resilience of many of these communities. And that's where, if we return, if we follow this through to the present, if we follow this through to land grabbing and this unused land narrative, this is what is so frustrating about that idea, because if you think about this, the unused land is never actually unused, because if so much of resilience has to do with a community or a household's ability to step back into, say, a Milpa strategy, step back into a strategy where they need a lot of forest in order to practice their agriculture, then that land, even if it appears to be uncultivated, is not being unused. And so the decision, again, to sell land, or when land is grabbed illegally, is a complete stop to an ongoing conversation that's been unfolding between people and the land for thousands of years. And unfortunately, because of the way those sales often go, communities are never able to step back into that flexibility. So that's how I think archaeology, in terms of the specific kind of research goals that I've had, can contribute towards this discussion, can provide ways to think about how we might push back against this useless land narrative. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is eating together in the field. So behold this archival photo I found of myself on my first season working in Yaxunah in the Ejido in 2013. And I just want to share a little bit about those first couple seasons. I was an early graduate student, and I was often very stressed out on excavations, where at lunchtime I would grab something, eat it, and then quickly get back to drawing. And when I did eat with others, it was usually with the other foreign or Mexican archaeologists, and we usually ate separately from the Yaxunah community members who are working on our project. And it's actually kind of crazy that this picture captures me eating a banana, because I basically should have been sponsored by Nature Valley, because all I would eat would be like one sweet and salty nut granola bar, and then go back to being very busy and working. But so then that kind of changed after a couple of years, and there's a few reasons why I think that changed. One is that my Spanish got better, and so I was able to communicate with people a lot better. But another important thing that happened was that a lot of things went wrong. I didn't get some grants that I had planned on getting. I had to scrap what I thought was going to be my dissertation project. And these things going wrong kind of made me lighten up, made me slow down a lot. And this shift in kind of a more chilled out version of myself happened to coincide with when I began work at Zacahuil. And if you remember from that map I showed you, Zacahuil is located at the edge of the Ejido. So for folks that were working at the Yaxunah archaeological site on excavations there, they would be able to, you know, have their kid drive out a bike to bring them food during the day. They could even walk back to town and go to the store if they needed to get something. But we at Zacahuil, we were a 30 to 40 very bumpy minute drive on my truck out at this edge of the Ejido. And so the people that were working out there on the project began coordinating among themselves to bring out very elaborate meals and eating them potluck style, these potluck picnics that we kind of had, and were generous enough to invite me. And so I'm grateful for them for inviting me to eat with them, and also to their wives and mothers who would be up, you know, at the crack of dawn cooking these foods for us to bring out. And as this new kind of culture that I was excited to be a part of at Zacahuil, where we would take very long lunches, we would all eat together, we would talk a lot. Those became, in a lot of ways, the most interesting parts of my day. The archaeology was still very interesting, but this was really what was making me think. And I began realizing during some of these lunches that there were openings happening. There were openings happening through these conversations and through these meals that were a counter to what later I would begin thinking of as this unused land narrative. That these were presenting opportunities for us to think differently about the role that these lands held to the community today and might hold into the future. So I want to share just a couple examples of particular meals that stand out in my memory that created what I'm thinking of as these openings to potentially push back against the unused land narrative. So the first, I remember so well this one meal. You'll see there's at the upper left, there's some vaporcitos that are wrapped up in banana leaves. Those are like tamales. There's a plastic bag of empanadas. We've got a lovely bowl of Coke, fresh tortillas that probably around the same time people at Noma were paying quite a lot of money for. And then in the Tupperware there, I remember being called over, summoned, ven a comer tu taco de Bambi, come eat your Bambi taco. And it was venison. And the story of this had been that a couple of the men that had been working at Zacahuil had stayed out in the Ejido after we had wrapped up excavations for the day and had been joined by a couple other men from town and had gone hunting and had been successful. And we were eating part of the spoils of that hunt. And I think about how in a lot of classic period Maya vessels, you'll see images of men returning victorious from the hunt, the deer, the tump line being carried back. And when I look back at this meal and how the eating of it actually was accompanied by stories of the hunt that had produced the deer, but then also stories of many other hunts that had happened in these lands before, I began thinking about how this harvesting of this wild meat from channels that are so far outside of capitals and so far outside the OXO convenience store is an interesting opening to thinking about how this land plays a role in reinforcing and solidifying relationships, not just between people in the land, but between people and others. And in this case, particularly among men. And I think this one is particularly relevant too to think about because as I was saying before, with the way things are today, so many men have to go out and look for work outside of their communities on construction projects and tourism. And so this prospect of hunting deer and harvesting wild meat, I think, presents opportunities for reinforcing these relationships with land and with others. The second meal that I want to share with you, the star here is that little Tupperware round thing at the bottom left, full of the beautiful tan liquid there. And there's also an omelet just glistening with manteca or lard, very good. But so let's focus on the tan liquid there. So on the day before this meal was eaten, at the end of the excavation, we're driving back and I'm driving, I've got a couple guys in the front with me and there's a bunch of guys in the back of the truck. And all of a sudden there starts slapping on the side, stop, 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 stop. So I stop everybody piles out. Someone comes over and says, there's a wasp nest up there. I say, okay, so we're going to try to get it. And don't worry, we're probably not going to get it, but we're going to try because we've been seeing it, and we want to try it before somebody else does, but don't worry, we're probably not going to get it. So I wait in the truck. Everybody else is down the road. And I kind of am watching in the rearview mirror, and I see somebody sitting up on somebody else's shoulders, and there's a branch going up, and I am watching, nothing's happening. It starts to get boring. So then I'm slumped over the steering wheel, about to fall asleep in the middle of the day. And all of a sudden I start to hear this mix of screaming and laughter that I will never forget. I pop up, I look in the rearview mirror, and I just see everybody running towards me. Someone is holding aloft what I think is that a gray football. Nope, it's the wasp nest. And everybody is yelling, start the car, but laughing and screaming. And it's very confusing. I start the car, everybody's piling in. Guys are next to me. They're saying, go, go, go. And I look, and Marcos still isn't in the car. What about Marcos? Just leave without him. And Marcos made it in the car. And we drove away, and nobody was stung. Nobody was hurt. The wasps did lose their home, though. And I like that story a lot, as you can tell, because I have my own little role in it where I drove the getaway vehicle. But that wasp nest was used to prepare a dish. You know, we were talking about eating insects before. With this particular dish, it was the woman who then prepared it. She took the comb out of the wasp nest, toasted it over a comal, and then blended the toasted larva with sour orange juice, chili, and salt. And then it created this beverage. This type of beer is known as shush ek. And again, in eating it, which it was good. I didn't want to think too much about the texture, but it was good. And it, again, like the deer, presented this opportunity for sharing these stories about procuring food opportunistically from the forest. And in thinking about, through those storytelling events, which, you know, I feel myself even getting into it today, just as an outsider, it presents these opportunities for thinking about how these wild foods still present opportunities to make our food systems more resilient. And I want to be clear, you know, it's not like the Yaxuneros or I were eating these meals and looking at each other and being like, you know, NAFTA is really bad. It wasn't like that at all. And this is still something that I'm hoping to explore. But I do feel really encouraged by this prospect of slow meals eaten on site, so eaten in the places that are contested, like the edges of the Ejido where we were working, give openings to reaffirm social connections to land and to push back against these unused land narratives through the power of food. I'm looking forward to exploring that more. So to wrap everything together here, the question that I explored with you today: how can archaeologists collaborate with communities to push back against this unused land narrative that undermines Indigenous Maya food sovereignty? I centered this around two different pathways that I've been checking out in the Yaxunah Ejido. First was in documenting long-term histories of TEK in landscapes, finding that flexibility and the ability to shift between strategies over time is so key to long-term resilience, really bulks up the idea that we can't talk about sustainability if we're not talking about Indigenous land tenure in the long term. And then second, the actual practice of eating together in the field, I think, opens a conversation towards how our actual practices as archaeologists can contribute more meaningfully in ways that address environmental justice conflicts like land grabbing. And so in looking ahead, I think that if archaeology can find ways to reaffirm connections to land, we, in the small way that we're able, may be able to support Indigenous food sovereignty by providing and imagining different sorts of stories besides the one that these lands aren't really useful, aren't really being used at all. And I think that by making our practices as archaeologists more engaged, we can also find ways to leverage what we're learning, what's happening in the ground through time, to document histories of TEK through the centuries, and also to figure out ways that our practices of slow food or deep food, as the term that Shanti introduced before, can help create different narratives than the ones that these lands are no longer useful. So thank you so much to everybody for listening and for the organizers. And I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Great talk and important issues.
Thank you.
We now have some time for questions and comments. I don't see any right now in the Q&A section, so I'll start. First of all, it'll be really interesting to see how your talk intersects with Megan and Sean's talk tomorrow when it comes to what archaeologists not only eat in the field, but how the whole food culture and food industry surrounds field work, and how maybe we could, as you say, advance a long-term reckoning of food justice and agricultural sustainability in the lowlands. Obviously, this is an eternal problem of not only archaeologists, but a lot of different projects in the area when people spend only a limited time per year in the area. So my question is, have you carried out questionnaires or discussed widely with the local people, men, women, elders, young people, how they see all this, and how would they like to advance a long-term sustainable cooperation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't done that work yet. I think that looking ahead, that's certainly something I hope to explore more. And so much of my thinking around what archaeology might contribute towards these things happened, it felt like on the fringes of the work that I thought was my real work, right? So we would stop excavations and end up having a conversation off to the side about why nobody was farming out there anymore, or what people thought about the Noma pop-up and cooking in it. And we'd have these conversations very informally. And it wasn't until later that I would look back and realize that that was actually the story that I think was really needing to be told, and not necessarily the one that I thought it was going to be. So COVID has, of course, kind of slowed things down. And so I haven't been back yet, but I hope when I return to continue work in Yaxunah, hopefully with Tracy Ardren and Harper Dine and others that are going to be back down there, that we can take on something exactly like what you're proposing.
Yeah, I think it will be, would be important to hear the voice of different people, because sometimes there are men might talk over women. So it would be interesting to see how you carry out the discussions and questionnaires so that everybody's voice will be heard.
Right. Absolutely.
Max has a question. So Max.
Hey, Chelsea, thanks for the great talk. You were talking about hunting and food security, and this really brought me to put in contradistinction two experiences that were not too dissimilar in terms of access to meat, which is interesting because I hadn't really thought about that in that disenfranchising of land. But in the work that I got to be involved with in Belize, in central Western Belize, we were working with the Social Archaeology Research Program in the middle of national land that was owned by the crown, basically the British crown, where people are allowed to settle, and it's very kind of free. And Belize is very low density settlement. And we would be doing these camping trips, and they're going for 10 days in the middle of nowhere. And we'd have enough food. We'd have to ship our water in, which was tough, but we'd have enough food for everyone, but it was not great. It canned spam and stuff like that as meat. So, but we did have some amazing workers who were also extremely good huntsmen. And so every night they would leave around, and they would leave camp and disappear in the bush with a flashlight and do this night hunting thing that's kind of crazy with flashlights. And every morning they'd come back with like a brocket deer or a peccary and all kinds of birds. And we'd try all these meats, which were amazing. That was a really cool experience. But then after that, I went to work in Guatemala in the national park there in the Laguna del Tigre, and there in the concession, and that's not too dissimilar from an ejido, but not exactly that either. That's being used by a specific community. We were at La Corona, which has perennial sources of water and within this area that can get pretty dry. And an amazing thing about that is there's crazy diversity of fauna that comes there every day to drink that water. And so we'd see so many animals, and there were many fishes as well. But because this was a national park, it was illegal to hunt, illegal to fish. And we were in the middle of nowhere, and we had to ship all our meat from town. But local workers, to their our extremely talented labor force, there was legally restricted and could not hunt at all. And sometimes some of them would go fish kind of illegally and fry some tiny fish. But with this amazing wealth of game meat, nothing could be eaten. And so that was kind of that contrast in that water depleted landscape filled with animals that people were hunting versus water rich landscapes with all these animals that no one could hunt was really interesting. And I never thought about it in terms of being disenfranchised regarding hunting practices, regarding specifically to men hunting.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about, just like how these modern laws have impacted the ways that people are able to practice their traditional ecological knowledge. And thinking about it from this perspective of environmental justice, I think you do start to see how it is a disenfranchisement. The other thing I would say is that just hearing about your experiences working in these other places reminded me of once when a grad student on our project complained to the director, Travis Stanton, that he hadn't gotten his Gatorade on his trip into Merida. And he told us that we had no idea how good we had it, and that projects in the Petén, barely had enough water to drink. And so I guess he was right. We were a little spoiled in the middle of the peninsula where we were.
Well, I have also done archaeology at Cajalpech, so I know the luxury too.
Well, thank you.
We have a common question from Anne. First of all, thank you for an engaging talk. It also shows how understanding wild foods can add to our knowledge of food waste in the past. Will you be looking into that avenue as you continue your archaeological explorations in the area?
I would like to. I think that I think wild foods is definitely a fascinating line for future inquiry, because I think so much of wild foods can be tied into these narratives of resistance. And I'm really interested next in looking at a colonial era hacienda or plantation that's in the Ejido of Yaxunah, and looking at how can understand how traditional ecological knowledge changed during the colonial era. And I think wild foods would potentially have such a compelling role at that time, because it would have allowed laborers on the hacienda at the time it was raising cattle, and to think about like how families were still able to get away from there into the forest or not to collect wild foods. So that's definitely, I'd be excited to look into that. And thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, and there's another from Michelle. Thank you for your for an excellent and thought-provoking presentation, but isn't there a bleak future for the Yucatan Peninsula with developments like Maya Tren, and the new Tulum International Airport?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that sometimes it does feel bleak, not just in Yucatan, but a larger scale sometimes. And I think that the dynamics that are happening on the ground from the train project. So for folks that don't know, there's this massive infrastructure project going on right now where a train is being constructed to connect Maya archaeological sites across Mexico over a huge area. And Yaxunah is part of these conversations too, because there will be a stop at Chichen Itza. And with the recent, what Harper was talking about with there being so much celebrity attention on Yaxunah right now, I imagine that the train project is going to really impact people's livelihoods there. So to that, I would say that these definitely are going to be challenges that I think are going to amplify the effects of land grabs and land privatization through legal channels. And so I share this sense of that things will probably be getting more challenging. And that's why I think that whatever ways we can find to align our work with efforts towards countering some of that in ways that support Indigenous land tenure and food sovereignty, I feel compelled to take that up.
And there's yet another from Rachel, were any of these issues raised during the negotiations of USMCA or United States-Mexico-Canada agreement?
Yeah, so the so-called new NAFTA, right? As far as I know, no, but I'm not as well versed in the policy nitty-grittiness as I would like to be, and so that's something else I'd like to learn more about. But as far as I know, there's still a lot of focus within USMCA and larger neoliberalization efforts, looking at questions of things like efficiency and measurable quantities and things like that. And this is, again, to return to this point where there's still this emphasis, say, on food security, are there enough calories, versus food sovereignty, which is who has the say in what foods are being eaten and how that's being grown. So my understanding is that policies like the USMCA are still very much coming from a perspective of measurable quantities, efficiency, and food security. So to my knowledge, these things were not raised in a way where it at least gained a lot of conversation. Thank you for that.
Thank you.